with Dr. Linsey Marr, who is the Charles P. Lunsford Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Virginia Tech. Professor Marr's research considers the interactions of nanomaterials and viruses in the atmosphere. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she has been studying how SARS-CoV-2 and other airborne pathogens are transported in air. She has also actively engaged with the press and social media to disseminate her knowledge and experience. This has included an impactful New York Times opinion piece on the virus's transmission in air and an interview on NPR on how to lower risk of transmittal, as well as many quotes in the press. Professor Marr studied engineering at Harvard University, graduating summa cum laude. She moved to UC Berkeley for her graduate studies in environmental engineering and joined MIT, working alongside Mario Molina for her postdoctoral work. Please welcome Professor Marr to speak with us about what happens when you open your mouth.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So to begin with, we know that the virus is being transmitted through the air, and it's important to realize that the airborne virus is not naked. We do not have naked, with any pathogens, bacteria or virus out there in the air or on surfaces. The virus is embedded in a respiratory droplet, which contains additional things besides water, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it's the size of this droplet or aerosol that defines its transport, not the size of the virus itself. So the virus itself is 0.1 microns. That respiratory fluid droplet carrying it could be anywhere from 0.2 microns to 100 microns or more. The images on the right show what dried respiratory droplets look like. Those are electron microscopy images, and you can see on the top one, that outer kind of ring shows probably the initial diameter of the droplet. The water evaporated, leaving behind that crystalline solid, which contains potassium, calcium, chloride, carbon, and sulfur, things that we would expect to see in the salts and organic components of the droplet. The pie chart on the right shows what the droplet is, what those non-volatile solids are. There are a lot of sodium chloride and some other salts. There's protein that can be anywhere from a quarter to the majority of those solids. There's some surfactant. The virus itself is far less than 1% of the solids. Next. When we talk, we produce aerosols. So we know that when we cough, we produce large droplets and some smaller aerosols. But when we just talk, we actually release a plume of aerosols. This is nice work done by Lydia Moroska in Australia, showing the size distribution of aerosols in larger droplets that are released when we speak, shown in the top panel, and when we cough, shown in the bottom panel. Notice that both the X and Y axes are shown in log scale, and there are more like three modes. The first smallest two modes are kind of, they overlap. So if we look at the speaking distribution, the black dashed line, you can see that there's a peak around 1 to 2 microns. This is for the droplets and aerosols right as they come out of our mouths before they have undergone any evaporation. And there's a little bit of a shoulder out there towards maybe 4 microns or so. And then there's a larger mode of these larger droplets. These are visible ones that is centered around 100 to 200 microns. Those only make up 1% of the total number of droplets and aerosols that we release, whereas 99% of them are in those smaller sizes, mostly less than 10 microns. Next. Now, if someone is infected, these aerosols may contain viruses. And when we speak and we say a phrase like "hello world," we release about 5 nanoliters worth of liquid. And if you have a kind of average load of viruses in your respiratory fluid, you might release 30 viruses in terms of the number of RNA copies of it. When you cough, you release a much larger amount of fluid. Because there are some large droplets, that would be 125 nanoliters and close to 1,000 viral RNA copies. Next. And this is why it's so important for us to cover our mouths. Source control means, just in traditional air pollution terms or water pollution, you go back to the source and reduce the amount that it is releasing into the environment. It's almost always much easier to do that than to try to clean something up or reduce its concentrations after it's been released in the environment. So the person here on the left is speaking and releasing maybe one large droplet and 100 to 200 aerosols, those little red dots. And what we're going to do is we're going to put a mask on her. Next. All of a sudden, we have blocked those large droplets and aerosols from getting out into the air. And now they can no longer spread in the air or build up in the air. So that is why masks are important. And Dr. Wang will be talking about that after me. Next. So I started opening my mouth about this topic early on in the pandemic because I've studied airborne transmission of viruses for over 10 years. It was evident to me that airborne transmission was important for this virus, and I knew there would be a lot of misinformation, panic, and fear and inaccuracies in how people talk about airborne transmission. So early in March, I tweeted out, "Let's talk about airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2 and other viruses. A discussion is needed to improve accuracy and reduce fear associated with the term." Back then, I probably had about 1,000 followers, and I pulled this screenshot yesterday. It looks like I have over 26,000 followers. There's not a lot of people who have studied this question from the aerosol science side and being able to understand what sizes are important and how they move in the environment. And so to counter the misinformation, and because of my specialized expertise, I realized it was really important for me to get out there and provide the correct information. And so that's what's really driven this, to provide correct information so we can use that to slow transmission. So the main thing I keep in mind when communicating science to the public is KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Not to imply that people are stupid, but to try to explain things in as clear a way as possible using everyday language, no specialized jargon. And if I do, to explain that and to try to relate complex scientific concepts using analogies that people encounter in their everyday life, like cigarette smoke. We can think of the virus spreading in air like cigarette smoke does. And then I learned an important lesson early on from Kim Prather, who's a professor at UC San Diego, National Academy member in Sciences and Engineering, who studies aerosols and has done a lot of communication on climate change. There are a lot of, yes, there are some uncertainties and nuances in this, but we do know enough to act. And so I took that message to heart. And yes, I could talk for hours about the nuances of various different aspects of airborne transmission. But the fact is that it's happening and we know how to slow it down. And then Dr. Stewart mentioned that I had an op-ed in the New York Times that I wrote. They asked me to write something, and it was an educational experience for me because my first draft was terrible. And then they asked me to completely rewrite it. So I submitted a second draft, and then the editor bled all over it, red ink everywhere, and it came out hopefully accessible to the public. Thank you for your attention.